Hello, folks. Well, for the next 4 or 5 of our videos, we're going to be going through discussing subroutines in programming languages. So basically just the idea that we've got some kind of named collection of statements that we want to be able to call. It'll go off, run those statements, and return. And typically with the ability for us to pass somehow information to that subroutine and some way for it to get information back to us. So we've got some kind of communication mechanism, whether it's shared memory, whether it's parameter passing, whatever it might be. We'll talk about different options for that. We'll talk about the implementation issues. Again, typically we're looking at the idea of a call stack. We'll talk about some alternatives to that as well, right? The idea that for every function call, there's a frame pushed somewhere on a runtime stack that's got information that's relevant for the current call. So any local variables, any parameters that are being passed, return values, that kind of thing. And this information is popped off when the function call completes. And again, generally the idea is that the caller suspends while the callee runs, and then the caller resumes where it left off when the callee finishes. So we'll talk about those aspects. We'll talk about the scoping rules. I'm assuming you've all got a solid background from the assembly language point of view, so you've got a good understanding of the runtime stack, but we'll touch on the issues as we go through there. And we'll talk about some of the more optional ideas that might crop up. So things like having nested function declarations where you can declare a function inside a function inside a function. Function overloading, generic functions or templated functions, higher order functions, all that kind of thing. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the syntax and terminology, and then in the next video we'll start getting into the guts of things. So typically in terms of your syntax, this is going to be another thing that's highly recognizable for your language, how you actually define a function, how you call a function, what those look like. So somewhere you're going to have to specify the name of the function. You might have to specify data types. Again, that depends on whether you've got a typed language or not. And something somehow that defines what kind of parameters you're expecting. Now, that's not always the case. There are some languages where you never specify the parameters to be passed. It's just somewhere inside the function. It looks for what it did receive instead. But we'll get into the idea of defining expected parameters, maybe expected parameter types. So we'll use this idea of the header to encapsulate all of that information. So if I talk about header, I'm talking about the name, the type, the profile, the parameters. Again, the profile is just the number, order, and possibly the types of the parameters that we're expecting. Again, just in terms of terminology, if we want to be specific about it, we can specify that a protocol also specifies the return type. So just different ways of specifying what combinations of things we're talking about. And then the full definition would be the header plus the body. So the idea is we've got the function call someplace where we have the actual request to run the function. And that's going to involve sending whatever information has to go off to it, the actual parameters, the values you want processed. So the caller is the one making the call, the callee is the function that's getting called, the subroutine getting called. And again, the idea is the caller stops, callee runs, callee finishes, caller picks up where it left off. We'll take a look at some of the issues surrounding return values and how that's going to work. In just a little bit more terminology, you will sometimes hear people make the distinction between functions and procedures, or the idea being a procedure does something but doesn't return a value. A function does something and does return a value. But for the most part, we're not going to be too fussed on that distinction. Okay, in the next video, we'll get into the mechanics and intricacies around parameter passing, and then we'll pick up with a whole bunch of different ideas after that.